That would be great. Everybody should get a prompt on their screen. So questions can be entered throughout the workshop today in the Q&A box in Zoom. We're going to do our best to field these questions as time permits. The Q&A function can be located on the bottom navigation bar in Zoom, and questions can be voted higher up on the list by clicking the thumbs up icon. So if you see a colleague who has entered in a question that you really want to make sure we get a chance to answer, if you click the thumbs up icon, it'll vote it higher up on the list. Comments regarding our rulemaking activity can be submitted to Commerce using the form that we've posted on our webpage. And I think one of our colleagues will put the link in the chat for everybody to use if you're interested in linking to that comment form. So we really value your input and your comments. We actively use this information to better shape administrative rules to meet your needs. So please continue to be engaged throughout the process. And we really appreciate your attendance today. Next slide, please, Annika. All right, Commerce's mission is to strengthen communities, and we do this through a broad range of policy and programs, including housing and homelessness, business assistance, community services, and energy, which is where our work is focused in the State Energy Office. Next slide. I wanted to provide brief introductions to our team, our Clean Buildings team. Our entire team is dedicated to providing timely, actionable, and clear information about the state's Clean Buildings Law. My name is Emily Salzberg, and I'm the Managing Director for the Buildings Unit within the State Energy Office. Your presenters today are going to be Judy Darst, Donnie Westfall, and Luke Howard, who are technical leads for Clean Buildings. We work with a talented team of staff focused on database development, policy development, and a broad range of program implementation. Next slide. So today's agenda, we plan to focus on administrative procedures for Tier 2 buildings, and this is for Clean Buildings compliance. The team has created and is proposing a new Annex Y to the standard. You'll notice that this Annex Y is very similar to Annex Z for Tier 1 buildings, with some modifications to better reflect Tier 2 compliance. We'll be focusing today's discussion on Tier 2 buildings, which are buildings between 20,000 and 50,000 square feet, and all multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet. Our objectives of today's workshop is to provide an overview of what's included in the law, to gather input on industry needs, and to review proposed language for administrative procedures for Tier 2 buildings. Next slide, please. So we have 2 more workshops that are planned after today's workshop, which will cover Tier 1 amendments and then a comprehensive overview in early September. And again, any of the information on our past workshops is available on our website. Next slide, please, Annika. So regarding rulemaking, we've been releasing draft language with each workshop and then hosting a public comment period on each topic for 2 weeks following the workshop. We're focused on this process being inclusive and participatory, and we welcome everyone to submit comments, and we'll do our best to reflect this input in our final rule set. Please use the chat function if you have thoughts to share throughout today's workshop. For questions that you would like the Commerce team to field, please use the Q&A function that is found at the bottom of your navigation bar in Zoom. Next slide, please. So this slide is a summary timeline for major milestones for Tier 2 requirements. The first phase of Commerce's requirements under the law are focused on rulemaking, as we just reviewed, and our planned topics for the workshops. Commerce is required to provide building owner notification by 2025, July of 2025, and to launch the incentive program on that same timeline. The first reporting cycle will take place in July of 2027, and then Commerce will be evaluating benchmarking data following the 2027 reporting cycle and may make a recommendation to the legislature to adopt a performance standard for Tier 2 buildings, which would come into place in 2031. And just a quick reminder for Tier 2 buildings, the first phase of this law is a reporting requirement. So buildings are required to benchmark, complete an operations and maintenance program and an energy management plan and report that to the Department of Commerce. At this point in time, there will be no performance standard for those Tier 2 buildings. Now I'll hand it over to Donnie to talk about public comments that we have received to date.
Thanks, Emily. Hello, everyone. My name is Donnie Westfall. I'm a technical specialist here with the Clean Buildings team. Going to summarize today some of the public comments we received from the last workshop that covered energy management planning and operations and maintenance program requirements. I just want to note that these comments are viewable on the Clean Buildings website. Next slide, please. We received a few programmatic suggestions. Suggestion to include building envelope components in section 6.6.1, which states that building systems being replaced must meet the most stringent energy efficiency requirements in federal and state standards and building codes. We had a request for an allowance to utilize existing operations and maintenance programs. This will likely be allowed so long as the existing program meets the requirements that are outlined in section 6 and normative Annex L. We do not have a required template for O&M programs. Regarding proposals for alternative to the qualified person for tier 2 buildings, we received a suggestion to develop online on-demand training similar to Seattle's tune-up specialist program. There was a suggestion that Commerce help to establish cohorts of similar building types around the state in an effort to encourage peer collaboration and sharing of best practices. And we received a request that Commerce clearly indicate if a tier 1 building meets specific exemptions, such as that under Z 4.1.2, where more than 50% of a building's gross floor area is classified as occupancy class Group F or high hazard Group H, but it still has a portion of that building between 20 and 50,000 square feet with a different occupancy. If that portion of the building would need to comply with tier 2 of the standard. This is a great suggestion, one that we'll seek to provide some guidance on here. Next slide, please. We received a suggestion for establishing a help desk to provide technical services for online training related to the alternative to the qualified person. We had a recommendation that Commerce develop energy management plan and operation maintenance plan templates that utilize a simple checklist format, with the suggestion that we also look into existing tools out there, such as those from the Better Bricks program, Energy Star, and Washington State University Energy Program. And then finally, we received a comment regarding just general concerns with cost of compliance for tier 2 building owners. I want to thank everyone for their submissions and just reiterate the value in these suggestions and comments. We really do appreciate all of your input in helping us develop the rules for this program. That is it for me. I'm going to pass it over to Judy Darst to discuss new terms and definitions. Thanks.
Thanks, Donnie. Hello, I'm Judy Darst, Technical Specialist at Commerce with Clean Buildings team. Next slide, please. This is a breakdown of the Clean Buildings Performance Standard by section. The standard is comprised of ASHRAE's Standard 100 with amendments from WAC 19450. The standard can be downloaded through the Clean Buildings website. This portion of today's workshop will be focusing on administrative procedures for tier 2 buildings. I'll be reviewing the definition section, and Luke will review the new Annex Y. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 5722 expanded the requirements of the Clean Buildings Standard to include tier 2 buildings. What is a tier 2 building? Who does this apply to? A tier 2 building is a building where the sum of the non-residential, hotel, motel, and dormitory floor areas exceeds 20,000 gross square feet, but does not exceed 50,000 gross square feet, excluding the parking garage area, and all multifamily residential buildings exceeding 20,000 gross square feet, excluding the parking garage area. Next slide, please. Here is a list of the new terms and definitions with proposed changes. I will be reviewing the terms in blue font in a little bit more detail. For the complete definitions, see the draft language. And the draft language document was emailed to all the registrants, and it will be available on the Clean Buildings website once it's posted next week. Within the draft language, the track changes shows proposed additions with underlines and the proposed deletions with strike through. Comments identify for the definitions the source reference, and it's either the legislative amendment via Senate Bill 5722 or Commerce's amendments. Next slide, please. So here's some changes. The term covered commercial building is now called covered building, and it includes tier 1 covered buildings and tier 2 covered buildings. The new term tier 1 covered building uses the same language for the past covered commercial building definition. So basically, a building where the sum of non-residential hotel, motel, and dormitory floor areas exceeds 50,000 gross square feet, excluding the parking garage area. The new term tier 2 covered building is the same definition we saw previously. And they started with the tier 1 definition format. So you can see the legislature arrived at this format for this tier 2 definition. Next slide, please. Compliance extension. This is a new term developed by Commerce to allow an extra 6 months time for building owners to complete their energy management plan, EMP, and to implement their operations and maintenance program, the O&M. Luke will be reviewing this in more detail in the next part of the webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, so for connected buildings, this is a new term developed by Commerce to explain a compliance option for buildings with a shared meter. We're introducing this as an allowance for tier 2 covered buildings as an alternative to sub-metering. So in this example shown here, the 3 separate buildings owned by one building owner sharing one energy meter are allowed to submit compliance documentation together. The blue building is the largest building at 25,000 square feet. Use this to determine the compliance is required under the tier 2 covered buildings requirements. The total gross square footage of the connected buildings is 64,000 square feet. This does not move the compliance requirements into tier 1. Use the total square footage to build the target EUIT with a weighted average for multiple building activities as applicable. In such instances, the benchmarking shall include building activity, gross floor area, and total energy consumption of all connected buildings. The implementation of the EMP and O&M program would need not apply to the uncovered buildings. It's the yellow building in the middle at 15,000 square feet. It's recommended, it's best practice, but it's not required. Instead, if a building decided to sub-meter the property, the green building at 24,000 square feet and the blue building at 25,000 square feet would each need their own meter and each would need to comply separately. The yellow building at 15,000 square feet is not covered and would not be required to comply. Next slide, please. So this term, contiguous property, is a new term developed by Commerce to define the boundary of the building with sole building ownership. This helps determine which properties are covered buildings. So in this example, on the left, there is an apartment building, one owner. Each unit is 10,000 square feet. So the 3 units together are 30,000 square feet and would be required to comply with tier 2 covered building. On the right is a condominium. It's one building, but 3 separate owners. Each separately owned unit is 10,000 square feet. So this 10,000 square foot units are not covered and are not required to comply. Next slide, please. Net energy use is a term that's amended by the legislature in Senate Bill 5722. There's a few edits and they added the second sentence on renewable energy production, shown with the underlines. These amendments better define the net energy use concept from the standard, allowing for renewable energy produced on a campus in the EUI calculation of a covered building. Next slide, please. Qualified energy manager is a new term developed by Commerce to define the minimum level of energy expertise for tier 2 building compliance document submittal. The intent is to ensure competency while remaining affordable. So we're proposing qualifications and a training to be a qualified energy management. This person would be allowed to perform compliance on tier 2 buildings. As a note, a qualified person or a qualified energy auditor can fill the role of a qualified energy manager on a tier 2 covered building. We're currently working to develop a training program for qualified energy managers. Next slide. Now Luke is going to review the new Annex Y administrative procedures. Take it away, Luke.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to cover kind of the proposed amendments in the slideshow here. I'm kind of pulling out a few specific amendments, and then we'll review the whole Annex Y and definitions proposals in the document that was sent out to participants, registrants to this workshop prior to today's workshop. And again, if you did not receive that because you registered later, we will be broadcasting that next week. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so building notification. We learned a lot about building notification during our Tier 1 building notification process a few years back. So Section Y, Y1 covers building owner notification. So before we can send building owner notification, Commerce has to first complete building identification and incorporate those buildings into the Clean Buildings portal. If you're familiar with the portal, it's a database of all covered buildings, and it provides building owners a secure system to manage their buildings compliance with the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. So our data lead, KJ, has been working hard on a strategy to identify all buildings between 20 and 50,000 square feet and all multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet, so Tier 2 buildings. So we have a few lessons learned from identifying Tier 1 buildings, as I mentioned earlier. We expect the new strategies to improve the notification process and with the help of GIS tools, and we have a new vendor that provides much of the data needed. So we have identified that vendor and will provide data needed for building identification and incorporate the building details into the portal. So hopefully that process will be much more efficient than it was prior. Next slide, please. So Annex Y, again, it's the administrative requirements for Tier 2 compliance. In general, Tier 2 requirements include benchmarking, implementation of the energy management plan, and the operations and maintenance program in accordance with the standard. There is an early compliance aspect of the administrative requirements. So early compliance can be submitted for as early as July 1st of 2025 for Tier 2 buildings. As part of the benchmarking requirement, the net energy use, so the development of the EUI for the building, must use energy data that does not exceed 2 years prior to the compliance date, whether you're compliant, early compliance, or on the general compliance date. Building owners can apply for a compliance extension, and I'm going to talk more detail about that later. But that will allow for another 180 days to implement the energy management plan and the operations and maintenance program for the standard. And the exemptions for Tier 2 compliance or Tier 2 buildings is the same list as for Tier 1. And we'll cover that in more detail further on this workshop. Next slide, please. Okay, did we skip a couple? Monica, can you go back? Okay, great. Sorry, go ahead and go to the next one. Okay, and this is an animated slide, so go ahead and click on it. So compliance documentation is going to include the similar forms as for Tier 1, but not all the forms from Tier 1 are applicable to Tier 2. Form A will be. So Form A is kind of a summary documentation of compliance. It lists the building owner, The folks that worked on the compliance of the building, so that could be the qualified person, the energy manager, a qualified energy manager if applicable. This is just a screenshot of our current Tier 1 Form A. It will be modified slightly for Tier 2. And for both Tier 1 and Tier 2, Form A will be implemented or built into our portal. So it'll all be electronic and not in a PDF format as currently required for early compliance. Through Form A, you are going to summarize your EUI, your EUIT, attest that the EMP and the O&M program have been implemented, and upload the EMP and the O&M programs to our portal. Next slide. Form B. Form B is the development of the energy use intensity target for the building. So it currently exists in the portal, as you see on the screen here, where you identify your building activity type or types, any shift normalization factors, and your climate zone, and it will calculate the energy use intensity target for that building. Next slide, please. Form C is your Energy Star Portfolio Manager account. We are currently connecting that account directly to our portal. So as a building owner or representative builds out their Energy Star Portfolio Manager account, there is a option within the account to share the data with Commerce, and there's a select amount of data that Commerce requests through that sharing. That's all outlined in Annex Y of the standard under Form C. And when we scroll through the proposal document after this slideshow, I will point that out to you. So this should be a pretty smooth process of submitting Form C. All you'll need to do is hit the share button within the Portfolio Manager account, and we'll obtain the building energy use data from Portfolio Manager. Next slide, please. Okay, exemptions. I noted that they are the same as for Tier 1 buildings, with the exception of some of the square foot requirements. Obviously, that Tier 2 is not buildings over 50,000 square feet, but between 20 and 50, or multifamily over 20,000. So there's exemptions for not having a certificate of occupancy. Maybe the building's brand new, it doesn't have 2 years worth of energy data, or excuse me, 12 months worth of energy data within the last 2 years. Maybe there's no physical occupancy for the building, so it's been not fully occupied. This is actually a 50% threshold, so if more than 50% of the building is not physically occupied, it is eligible for an exemption. The gross floor area of the building minus any unconditioned or semi-heated spaces is less than 20,000 square feet. And then we do have the exemptions for manufacturing, such as factory group F and high hazard group H. And agricultural uses, buildings pending demolition, and buildings with specific financial hardships. So if you want more information on these exemptions, we have published guidance documents on our website under the document library section. You can get more details regarding these exemptions. They were written for Tier 1 buildings, but same will apply to Tier 2. Just some of the third bullet here with the square footage thresholds is obviously going to be changed. Next slide, please. Okay, so for Tier 2 covered buildings, An extension means that you get an extra 180 days to implement the EMP and the O&M. Part of the extension application is to send in your benchmark data. So you need to, by the point that you submit an application for extension, you will need to have created an EUI through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager account and completed Form B on our portal, which develops the energy use intensity target for the building. So in order to apply for that extension, Forms A, B, and C will need to be submitted. Next slide. Okay, so penalties for failing to comply with Tier 2 requirements in accordance with the standard may result, and those penalties will be up to 30 cents per square foot. So Commerce will give building owners that are out of compliance on the compliance date 30 days to pay the penalty, apply for an exemption, apply for an extension, or formally appeal. Again, approved extension applications will give building owners an extra 180 days to complete the EMP and O&M program requirements. So fines collected from penalties will fund low-income weatherization and structural rehab assistance programs through the state. Next slide. Okay, so this is a basic flow chart kind of showing how that penalties work. So if you found to be out of compliance at the compliance date, you will be sent a NOVCI, notice of violation, of opportunity to correct, and intent to assess penalties. So, great acronym there. So if you do receive that after your compliance date, your options are to send in compliance documentation. Can you have up to 30 days? Apply for an exemption if eligible. Apply for an extension, request a hearing, or just pay the penalty. Again, the penalty will be 30 cents a square foot. Again, if you are eligible for exemption, you comply. If you send in your compliance documents, you will comply. If you are eligible for compliance extension, you get an extra 180 days to implement that energy management plan, operations and maintenance program. Again, if you have a successful hearing, then we won't bother you anymore. If you pay the penalties, then you pay the penalties and you're good to go for the full cycle, which is a 5-year cycle. Okay, next slide. And I think what we're going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to jump over to the proposals. Annalyn or Annika, are there any burning questions that should be answered now, or can we wait till after this part?
I think we can wait.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, Annalyn, since you're off the mic, can you tell me, can you see my screen fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if you've received this document already, you've had a chance to look at it. If you haven't, you will. We will broadcast it out early next week, but for all registrants, you should have received this already. So Senate Bill 5722, as noted before, was signed into law in 2021. It's Commerce's duty to create rules to align this clean building expansion to the current standard. Again, these are for expansion is for smaller cohort of buildings between 20 and 50,000 square feet, and all multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet. So we really do appreciate and encourage formal comment. We are better informed when we get input from stakeholders and to help influence the creation of these rules. So again, these are proposals. And some of these proposals were actually developed from the influence of people making comments. Throughout this document, you'll see, several different formats. Black font is font, it means sections that are straight from ASHRAE standard 100. So the blue font represents Washington State amendments in WAC 194-50. So when you see blue font, that will be, the whole section will be in blue font. It doesn't mean that WAC 194-50 amended every word within that section. But it does mean that that section was modified from the original ASHRAE standard to conform with legislation requirements here in Washington. Red font are the track changes showing drafts, additions, and deletions. There are comments that we've put in the sidebar to kind of identify why we made some of these amendments or where those amendments came from. Yellow highlight and track changes in Annex Y highlight key differences between Tier 1 Annex Z and Tier 2 Annex Y. Again, because these are all in blue font because they represent 194-50 from Annex Z. And since we're just modifying Annex Z for Annex Y, we're tracking the changes through the yellow highlights as well as the underlining and the strike throughs. Comment through the link that is in the chat. I think Annalyn or Annika put that link in your chat early on. You'll see it towards the top of the chat. So benchmarking is a definition we put in to kind of further clarify what benchmarking means. I believe most of this language, if not all, was taken straight from the Department of Energy. A lot of these definitions you may have seen in previous workshops as well. So there are some changes to building owner. There is a new definition for building tenant. These were all specific changes from the legislation, Senate Bill 5722. So they felt it was important to identify that in the event of a land lease, the building owner is the entity possessing title to the building on leased land, as well as the building tenant, a person or entity occupying or holding possession of a building or premises pursuant of a rental agreement. Again, the blue text is WAC 194-50, which is the Clean Buildings amendments to ASHRAE standard 100. The black is straight from ASHRAE 100. We have identified or defined compliance extension in more detail here. We've talked about that already. Conditional compliance, we made sure to amend this because conditional compliance is a allowance that's specific to Tier 1 buildings that have a performance metric. Again, Tier 2 buildings do not need to meet an energy use intensity target or the investment criteria of the standard. Perhaps it would be helpful if let me know. I'm trying to incorporate some of these notes to the right. Again, when you have the document, you can read all those. Hopefully the text on your screen isn't too small at this point. So there is a definition of connected buildings. As we noted Judy noted already. Contiguous property, that's a new definition. We amended the covered commercial building to be in adherence with the legislation. New definition of director. It's the director of the Department of Commerce or the director's designee. Provided some more clarity for energy use intensity targets. Is not adopted verbatim from ASHRAE standard 100. Instead of energy target, we use the term energy use intensity as seen below. Gross floor area, the original definition in 194.50 was in error. There was not a comma between equipment and storage areas, or excuse me, there was, and we struck that out, as well as the term crawl spaces here. Crawl spaces are not part of the gross floor area. This was in an error. None of these, or both of these issues, crawl spaces and the misplaced comma are not in the original definition within the legislation or within the common definition you'll find in other standards and codes. We have amended the definition of lighting schedule. And we would like to see lighting schedules as part of the EMP down to the luminaire level. They not necessarily need to be to the lamp level. Again, lighting schedules do include a lighting power density. Multifamily residential was defined by 5722. We inserted that within the standard. That's proposed amendment. Net energy use, its definition has been expanded a bit, and that includes allowance for renewable energy produced on a campus that is not attached to a covered building may be deducted doing the EUI calculation for the building. So again, Clean Building Standard will allow for credit to the EUI when renewable energy is produced on the campus. We have inserted a definition of physical occupancy. This will help provide clarity to the exemptions. So physical occupancy means space that is used by an owner or tenant, regardless of occupant density and frequency of use. So a building does not have physical occupancy and is considered unoccupied when 50% or more of the conditioned floor area is not leased or is otherwise vacant. Hopefully that provides some clarity pertaining specifically to the exemptions. New term, qualified energy manager. It's an individual designated by the building owner who has 3 years of experience, including educational and or professional experience with commercial building operations and or building energy management, in addition to successful completion of Clean Buildings Tier 2 training program as specified by the AHJ. AHJ being commerce. So this is to provide for a rather than Tier 2 buildings having to use a qualified person that has more training and experience, it's an allowance to ensure that the folks working on the compliance for tier 2 buildings have a minimum amount of experience. Again, the legislative definitions of tier 1 and tier 2 covered buildings that Judy covered in the slideshow. So the original definition of weather normalized WNEUI was weather normalized energy utilization index, which is pretty much synonymous with energy use intensity. However, energy use intensity is the term used throughout ASHRAE Standard 100, so we wanted to make it consistent throughout. Okay, let's jump into Annex Y. Again, the areas highlighted in yellow are the amendments we've made from Annex Z. So we adjust the square footage to represent the minimum threshold for tier 2 buildings, 20,000 square feet. Some more details. This section or this amendment just provides more detail about who is responsible for compliance. So when a covered building undergoes a change of ownership, it's the buyer's responsibility to contact AHJ and update the building's file. So the tier 2 kind of updates used to say covered commercial building, which would apply to tier 1. Amendments to show that meeting a target is not a requirement of tier 2, but the EMP and O&M and benchmarking is required. The allowance for compliant extension. Exemption application timeframe. As many of you know, that timeframe was originally 365 days to 180 days prior to compliance date. It was amended for tier 2-1 buildings to 3 years prior to compliance date. For tier 2 buildings, you're allowed 2 years prior to the compliance date to apply for exemption. Again, changing the threshold to represent tier 2 buildings. Exemptions, again, are quite similar. This is the financial hardship requirements. No changes to those. Again, if you're interested in more details about the exemption requirements, we do have guidelines on our website under the document library. Some amendments to the actual forms and reporting requirements to represent tier 2. So again, buildings do not need to meet an EUIT or the investment criteria. There is no performance metric at this point for tier 2 buildings, but we do require benchmarking and the submittal of Form A, B, and C to document that benchmarking, as well as implementation of the EMP and the O&M program, operations and maintenance program. A little more detail for buildings that are approved for compliance extension. Once compliance extension is approved, documentation to verify that the EMP and O&M is complete and being implemented must be submitted to the HJ or Commerce. Talked a bit about the penalties within the slideshow. You can review the details of that here in section Y 5.2. We tried to greatly simplify it from the tier 2 requirements. And we're noting the fact that you can apply for a extension if you do receive an NOVCI or notice of violation. So again, you'll have 30 days after receiving an NOVCI to either comply, apply for exemption, apply for extension, appeal, or pay the penalty. The fine will be 30 cents per square foot of gross floor area. So for a 20,000 square foot tier 1 building, that would be $6,000. If you receive a notice of violation, you do successfully demonstrate compliance either through exemption after an extension, you are eligible for early adoptive. You may be eligible for early adopter incentive. Again, if you don't show successful compliance or challenge, you'll be fined 30 cents per square foot and would not be eligible for early adopter incentive. Down to the forms, we're just going to highlight the differences between forms for tier 2 and tier A or tier 1. So tier 2 requirements. A qualified person can be the representative that's submitting compliance documents. It doesn't have to be a qualified energy manager. Qualified person could be the one representing and is a more higher level of credentials, so it supersedes the qualified energy manager. But we have entered a data point within Form A for the qualified energy manager, if that's what the building owner is using to gain compliance. Again, the qualified energy manager, their Commerce will have a training program for that. It will be most likely an online training program, and you will receive a certificate number through that training program. We will strike out sections or items 10 and 11 that are currently part of Form A. Those are relative to the energy audit and measurement and verification processes. Again, tier 2 requirements do not require performance metric. So sections 8 and 9 of the standard are not required for tier 2. And that's represented here in Form A modifications. Form B is the energy use intensity target form. Again, that's available through our portal and will assist in the calculation of the energy use intensity target for the building, which is part of benchmarking. Form C, we made an amendment here stating that if a building is a covered building is master metered, so sharing a meter with other buildings that may be covered or not covered, they can report their benchmarking at that connecting building level. No requirement for sub-metering tier 2 buildings. Form D is not applicable to tier 2. We do not require audits for tier 2 buildings, as well as the Form F, which is the life cycle cost analysis tool, not required for tier 2. Not applicable is Form G, which is the documentation of historic significance. Again, we're not requiring any modifications to the buildings in tier 2 requirements, so that should not affect the historic significance of a building. Exemption certificate, Form H, that is applicable. And there will be minimal changes to that. essentially the same thing. It's just that square footage threshold or that I noted in the slideshow. So that's the extent of the proposals for the Annex Y and definitions. Annika or Annalyn, were there any questions I should answer while I have this open, or can I give the floor back to the slideshow?
I believe we're on the Q&A section. If you want to give Annika the floor for that.
Oh, great.
Okay,
Thanks.
so there's quite a few questions that came in. Let me just go through them all. Okay. Looking in two places. Okay, confirming the connected buildings definition applies to tier 1 and tier 2.
So I put a little bit in the chat about that. The connected buildings, as we propose so far, applies to tier 2 requirements. We will have, I believe the next workshop is going to be focused on tier 1 amendments. So we like to call it tier 1 cleanup. So it's going to range in everything from dotting I's and crossing T's to proposing that there are some allowances for connected buildings under certain circumstances for tier 1 buildings as well. So stay tuned for the next workshop in order to participate in that conversation. But we believe that there's some room to introduce a connected building allowance for tier 1 buildings under specific circumstances, which would negate the need to install submetering in order to meet the EYT performance metric of tier 1 requirements.
Great, thanks, Luke. Next question, is there a space in Form A or elsewhere to identify building owner versus tenant responsible for compliance where lease terms put compliance burden on tenants? I replied with, there's no specific field to identify building owners versus tenant, but it's a great suggestion. We're going to consider adding it. Luke, do you want to add to that?
Oh, well, I would just say that, the legislation is specific. It says the building owner is responsible for compliance, whether they, I guess it would be up to the building owner to define that in their tenant lease agreement, that if they want to make the tenant responsible for that participation in the compliance requirements, then that's something they could do within. I don't know if it's within our purview to codify that.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Next question. Semi-heated corridors can combine multiple buildings into one, but the square footage of this, but the square footage of the semi-heated corridor can be subtracted. Question mark. So let me read that.
Okay, let's see if I got this question, if I understand this question correctly, but there's a definition within the standard applies to buildings and building complexes. There's a definition of building complex, and that definition is buildings interconnected through conditioned space on contiguous property. The definition of conditioned space is conditioned space that is directly or indirectly conditioned. So a corridor that is not directly heated may be indirectly heated in accordance with the definition of conditioned space within the standard. So that would mean there's no building envelope separating the conditioned space from the corridor.
Okay, let me just add to that. So so Nathan was told that semi-heated spaces are considered a subset of the conditioned space definitions for the standards purpose. Is that accurate?
Yes. So yeah, a semi-conditioned space is still a conditioned space. It's a subcategory of conditioned space. The exemption in for unconditioned space says the exemption applies to unconditioned and semi-conditioned spaces. So it can include, if you're calculating the gross floor area in terms of its application to the exemption, you can include the semi-heated space, but as defined in the standard. Hopefully
Okay,
that answers the question.
So if I understand right, semi-heated is a subset of conditioned, but, and so therefore semi-heated corridors can connect buildings. But per your slide on this presentation, I can subtract the area of that corridor that's semi-heated, right?
For yeah, if it's now the intent of semi-heated spaces to kind of represent the freeze protection definition. That's semi-heated for the most part, as defined by codes and standards, represents the freeze protection requirements. So as far as defining whether a building is a building or a building complex, I think that's going to be vary depending on the situation. Nathan, we may have to talk about this a little more in detail.
Well, yeah, it sounds like semi-heated is a subset of
Yes.
conditioned.
Yep.
But semi-heated space can also be subtracted from gross floor area, correct?
Semi-heated space can be subtracted from gross floor area when we're speaking directly about the exemptions.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's what
Yep. Yep.
yeah, no,
But
that's all my question is there.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And when we're defining gross floor area for whether it's a covered building or not. So do we have 50,000 square feet gross floor area? That includes both the conditioned, semi-conditioned, and indirectly conditioned or semi-conditioned space.
Thank you.
Yep.
great, thank you. Next question, is it possible to add owner and tenant to the standard contact list for specific building? Will help to ensure all parties receive info from Commerce.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we'll have to look at it. That kind of really makes notification quite a larger task than it already is. If we're both identifying the owner and the tenants, I'm not sure how we would get all of that information publicly about the tenants, but good question.
Okay, next question, is the 30 cents per square foot per year prorated if you miss the deadline by less than a year?
So it's not prorated. Again, we give the it's a 30-cent per square foot for that cycle, so for that period. So you're not going to get an annual bill of 30 cents a square foot. That will cover the whole cycle. We'll have to make sure, we'll look at the proposal to make sure that language is clear in there. It's not prorated. You do get the 30 days of to reply to the NOVI or the notice of violation. And if you apply for an extension and that extension is approved, remember you need to benchmark in order to apply for the extension, then you get another 6 months. So in theory, you could get up to 210 days total as an extension.
So it sounds like the fine, it's pretty, you know, it's not like time dynamic, right? So like
Right.
if
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Because
Yeah.
that always that kind of confused the crap out of me when I was reading
Yeah.
the original
Yeah. And that's part of the reason we
language.
changed that so that we
Yeah.
wouldn't have that.
So in theory, yeah, it can't be prorated to be less. And then if you were to not pay your fines in excess of a year, it wouldn't necessarily be more, right?
Right. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Makes it easier to remember that way.
Will there be the $5,000 fine or the,
Yeah, there is no base fee like with the
Okay.
tier 1 requirements. It will just be flat 30 cents per square foot as the total fine.
Is there a proposal for escalation for second round to be higher if still not compliant, similar to tune-ups currently in Seattle?
You know, that's something that we'll have to look at after we go through the initial compliance period, because again, we will be revisiting the rules after 2027, and that may be something to be considered. That's a good comment.
what
Yeah,
about
Luke, and if
collection
I can
fees?
add,
Sorry.
yeah, I just was gonna pipe in real quick. If I can add, we would love to get your comments on the penalty fines for tier 2 buildings. Our goal was to keep things as simple as we could, not only for the building owners in the industry, but also just from an administrative standpoint. So if there's items we should be considering, please do submit comment to us on that. We're happy to consider it.
So there, I think there was a comment about late fees and collection fees. There are no specific collection fees. We can raise the fees based on inflation over time. I don't think that's going to happen within a cycle, however. Anybody else from the commerce team have comment on the fees and penalties?
I don't have any further comment, Luke, but we really appreciate the thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
One additional kind of question comment on fines. Tune-ups currently kind of use them as a negotiating tool and say, you know, X amount fine. If you do these things, we can reduce the fine.
Mhm.
Is there a intention by Commerce to do something similar?
You know, originally we thought about, you know, structuring it like we do for tier 1, which has a mitigation pathway where you can reduce fines and have a you know, it can be prorated essentially based on the time it takes for you to actually meet compliance. You know, that's certainly a great comment. Some kind of fine reduction based on an agreement between Commerce and the building owner may be useful to encourage compliance and not just pay the penalty, and also provide a little bit of relaxed penalty for the building owner that's just late.
Thanks.
So if that's it on the penalties topic, we'll move on to the next question. What will Commerce be checking on Energy Star Portfolio Manager? Tune-ups check several data points for accuracy, consistency, and errors. What will Commerce be doing the same?
You know, we have not formally created a Q&A process. We will be identifying that over the next couple of years prior to compliance, and we will be able to kind of identify useful QA processes shortly as we start getting early compliance submittals, application submittals. So we can kind of start playing around with that. Looking into how the tune-up program does it currently would be very useful. So reaching out to our friends at the city of Seattle in order to do so glean from their experience will certainly be something that we do.
Great, thanks, Luke.
I will note that I was going to show you, which failed to remember, the details of Form C, so all the data points that we are receiving from Portfolio Manager. But if you'd like to look at that proposal document that I just ran through, you'll find all the different requirements under Form C in Annex Y, at the bottom of Annex Y.
Yep, and if you registered late and you didn't receive the email with the proposed language, I'll be sending up a follow-up email with the proposed language and hopefully the link for this recording so you could further review it again before you submit comments. So next question, it's more of a comment. It's definition of motion sensor specifics. Definition of motion sensor specifies outdoor lighting, suggests adding indoor as well.
Thanks for the comment.
Okay, next one. Will the school, in quotes, campus designation apply to Tier 2 building? If so, should a campus of a Tier 2 building exceed 50,000 gross floor area in total, does that bump it to Tier 1?
So if no individual building on that school campus, as defined by the standard, is greater than 50,000 square feet, then there would be no Tier 1 requirement. If a single building or a collection of interconnected buildings under the definition of complex is greater than 50, it would be a Tier 1. So, but for example, there are schools out there, let's say, Evergreen Elementary School has a bunch of quads, and they're all the largest. They may only be 1,500 square foot classrooms in a quad, so a total of 10,000 square feet, including the common area. That would be not even a Tier 2 building, but there may be a gym that's 20,000 square feet or 25,000 square feet. If that gym is not interconnected through conditioned space with other buildings, and that's the largest space, it would just be a Tier 2 gym. If that campus is interconnected through a master meter, so that gym is also on the same meter as those quads, and there may be 4 or 5 quads that are all under 10,000 square feet, the gym would need to implement the energy management plan and operations and maintenance program because it is technically a covered building. The quads would not be required to implement that EMP. The benchmarking, instead of having to sub-meter that gym, the benchmarking is allowed to be done at that campus level. So hopefully that provided the clarity you're looking for.
Thanks, Luke. Next question, does Commerce have data on expected costs, maybe per square foot of compliance, cost of metering, monitoring, cost of edits, of EMs, consultants, and administration? Seattle's OSE provided some interesting data on costs for tune-ups. Would be great if Commerce had something similar.
Luke, you want me to take this one?
Sure.
Okay, so we do have some limited cost data available that was part of our small business economic impact statement during our Tier 1 rulemaking. We'll be doing some additional cost survey as part of this follow-up Tier 2 rulemaking. I do want to call attention to this last legislative session and budget development. There was funding included in the most recent budget to stand up a work group to evaluate the fiscal impact of compliance with clean buildings. It is specific to Tier 1 buildings, and membership of that work group is listed in the budget proviso. The timeline for that work group is going to be extending into 2025 with some interim reporting to the legislature. So just want to let everybody know quite a bit of that cost analysis will be underway here, over the next year and a half. If there's interest in staying, abreast on the development of that work group, we can ensure that we're posting information to our website, or you're always welcome to ask questions to our customer support team. Luke, I don't know if there's anything you want to add with cost data specifically, but I just kind of wanted to give that big picture overview.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I guess the only thing I would have to say is, you know, the costs obviously are going to be different between tier 2 and tier 1 because of the no performance metric requirement for tier 2.
Great, thanks, Luke. Next question, is there a detailed start to finish flowchart for compliance? I responded to this and I just said that there's no, there's currently no flowchart for tier 2 compliance. We intend on creating it once our rules are finalized. So just keep an eye on that. And then the next question, do the error corrections to the GFA definition apply to tier 1 buildings as well?
You know, as far as the notification of covered buildings, yeah, you know, if you've received notification for a tier 1 building and there is a correction of error that is needed, please contact Commerce.
Okay, and I'll put the link to the customer support form in the chat.
Hey, Luke,
Yes.
I submitted that question. I'm Stephen with Everett Public Schools, and I think I know the answer, but it was really around the error corrections and the definition of gross floor area. You talked about that,
the crawl
the comma and the crawl space.
space. Right.
I think they would apply, but I just wanted to make
Yep.
sure.
Yep. Yeah, that's going to be an overarching definition corrections. So there will be no separate definition for tier 2 as there is for tier 1. All the definitions would be the same where applicable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Next one, let's see. We are a critical access hospital. I have received no letters saying that I have covered buildings. Should I have received anything? I can take part of this. So initial notification letters for tier 1 has gone out. If that's what you're referring to specifically, you could request a copy of that letter, and I will put a link in the chat. If you're talking about tier 2 notification letters have not gone out yet. We will still need to finalize rulemaking and do building identification. You can expect those in 2025.
Okay, this is Adam. I appreciate that answer. I'm part of a facilities group, and some other individuals that qualify under tier 2 have mentioned that they're doing some data collection already and documentation. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything as far as a covered tier 2 building.
Yes, a great thing to say, because most people have been asking for a notification letter for tier 2, and yet, no, just to clarify, nothing has gone out yet. You won't see that for a couple of years, and it's important to kind of do the building identification process first, just so that we don't misnotify as much as we did before, just to kind of lessons learned.
Absolutely. So as far as tier 2 buildings are concerned, I'm a simple person and I just need simple answers. We're not, as of right now, there's no requirements for documentation or data collection for tier 2 buildings, correct?
No.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. Has there been any decision made on if the lighting schedule will be required for tier 1 buildings that meet their EUITs, or is there an estimate on when this decision will be made?
So currently the proposal is that the lighting schedule would not be required for buildings tier 1 or tier 2 as part of the energy management plan when the building's EUI is less than or equal to the target, or if a lighting upgrade has sponsored by utility has been implemented within the last 5 years. That's the current proposal. We'd love comments if you have comments to that.
Yeah, and just to kind of sneak peek, next workshop will be on tier 1 amendments, and I believe this is part of some things we're going to discuss. So next question, where does the state get its data for where to send notification letters for all the covered buildings? So I'll take this and maybe Emily can add to it. Initially for the tier 1 buildings, it was a combination of different methods to identify the buildings, which was GIS and the LiDAR technology. And it had layers that we've used to identify some of the buildings. We also used assessor data, OSPI, and some state databases. As far as who we identified as the building owner, that would have been from the partly from assessor data, where it was identified who I believe it was like the taxpayer. Emily, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's great, Annalyn. It definitely captures our approach with tier 1, and I think tees up how we're looking at building identification for tier 2. I do want to note, though, with multifamily over 20,000 square feet being included with tier 2, our building identification is a bit more complex and is much larger exponentially. So we're evaluating a number of different data sets available to help with that multifamily residential piece as well.
Yes, and if you have some insight or some suggestions that would be helpful, please let us know and submit a comment. Let's see, I think that's all the questions we have, unless I missed any. I think that's all the questions we have. We'll give it a few minutes just for people to think about a question and type it in.
So just to fill dead air while people think of questions, just a reminder, next workshop is going to be focused on tier 1 amendments, cleanup, and then we'll have a cumulative review of all the proposals that we've reviewed in all previous workshops, plus any revisions to those proposals based on comments we've received through this process.
Hey,
Final rule. Go ahead.
I sorry, I got distracted by someone else when you were answering my question about where the state gets its data for where, it knows to send the notification letters. I think kind of understanding that may be helpful for, people to track down notifications, and maybe for the state and understanding where their notifications are going. I've heard kind of different things on this, but not necessarily from you guys. So I was kind of hoping to know the answer to that one.
Okay. So I'm just gonna say for tier 1 buildings, when we've for building identification, we use several different ways to identify buildings, including GIS, LiDAR, layers, and we use assessor data, OSPI, and state. So depending on what type of building you are, we've got information from different sources. As far as identifying who the actual building owner and who to send the letters to, it went to what's on file for the taxpayer. in the assessor.
For the county?
Yes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And then for tier 2, it's going to be a little different because one, it's the volume of buildings that we're going to deal with and building owners and including multifamily. So we're looking at a vendor that provide that information. We may, depending on what KJ strategies comes up with, probably within the next few months, and lessons learned on how we're doing this, it'll be set to hopefully be a lot smoother than the first time around. We're also considering, we didn't mention this, but we're also considering using a platform where the public can engage to verify the information, like an open GIS map and something to that effect, so that building owners can verify the information. And we'll also have, a notification letter request similar to tier 1. So if you didn't receive it or it was placed somewhere, you could always request for it in the future.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I've just heard, at least for City of Seattle, like they, sometimes these addresses are like a lawyer's address.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
the notification goes to a lawyer who may or may not be in state. And, if you're not getting a notification, maybe that's where it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We do our best and what we can to get the notification letters to a address that's associated with the building owner. It may go to an entity that loses it in the pile. And ultimately, it's the building owner's responsibility to comply with the standard, and we do our best, and we will continue to do our best to find the right people to talk to.
Yeah, it seems like a imperfect process to me.
Yeah.
I mean, what if you had the post office, like, just, try to identify these or give these identified buildings to the post office, and then just have the post office, make sure it gets delivered to the physical address.
Yeah. And then how does they get? Yeah, you might go to the physical address.
Yeah,
there's complications, but that's something to think about.
sure. Just my 2 cents there.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Any suggestions to improve an imperfect process is greatly received. We realize that there is no central database for this, and kind of creating something.
A new question came in. So for tier 1, do you have EUI targets available for 5-year cycle after this first year cycle?
Yeah, we don't. We currently we are charged with evaluating the current targets or reevaluating the current targets, I think in 2029. So that would inform us about targets for the 2031 on 2031, 32, and 33 cycles, which are based on the building size cohort. We don't have that yet, but we will be evaluating that. Commerce is charged to reevaluate that for the following cycle.
I would second that question. It's nice to be able to, from a capital planning standpoint, have much farther view of what the EUI targets are going to be, and get an idea for when a building is no longer going to comply if it's borderline, or maybe get an idea of whether how close a new building is,
Sure.
if something's being proposed. So
I think one of the reasons the legislation noted to reevaluate targets after the first cycle was to get a better understanding of where the first targets really lie. And then they can base a projected targets out into the future on a more realistic understanding of what's actually existing. The initial targets were based on national and regional data sources on commercial building energy use surveys. So our consultant did the best they could with the resources they had. It's certainly much more regionally specific than the national data, Energy Star or ASHRAE 100. But hopefully in the future we can get that projected out, and maybe there will be a bill or some legislation in the meantime that will demand that there's a projected target schedule out into the future for future cycles.
Yeah,
Great.
Luke, I think that's a really important point. And Cameron, thanks so much for that feedback. It's really helpful. When we did the original target setting, the state did not have a statewide benchmarking law in place at that point in time. So as Luke mentioned, we hired a consultant to work with the best available data. When we go to reset target zone 2029, we will have access to that statewide benchmarking data, which will better position us to set those targets and then have reasonable reductions into the future on 5-year cycles. So that'll be our work heading into 2029.
Great, thanks, Emily. We'll still accept questions, but can you advance to the next slide, Annika? So I just want to talk about next steps. So this workshop again is recorded, and the slide deck recording and proposed rules will be on the website sometime next week, and will be emailed to those who registered hopefully by tomorrow. So please take some time to review the materials and submit comments through the comment form. For general questions or comments, feel free to email us or submit a customer support ticket form. There's a schedule change with the next 2 workshops. The next workshop was previously scheduled for August 3rd. It's now August 24. I put the registration link in the chat. It'll also be emailed to you along with the materials and links for this workshop. Again, the next workshop will talk about Tier 1 amendments. So if you registered for the August 3 workshop, you don't need to register again. You should have received an email of the date change. However, if you saved it on your calendar, you'll need to manually move it to August 24, but I'll also put that in the email. So the final workshop originally scheduled for August 24 is now September 7. Same thing. If you registered, you don't have to register again, and then you'll have to change it to September 7 on your calendar. There'll be a comprehensive reviews of the proposed rule. So that's the final one. It will incorporate some of the comments submitted. So it's important to get those comments in before it's too late and before we submit our CR 102. So you'll notice that our website hasn't been updated with the new dates. We're working on that. We apologize for the delay. So a request for an update has been submitted. So hopefully you'll see those changes soon. If you haven't already and you're interested, take our Tier 2 building compliance costs and cost savings survey. It will close at the end of the month if you can. And then next slide, please. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Clean Buildings team for attending and continue to participate in our rulemaking workshop and submitting those comments. We certainly appreciate it. We appreciate your time, attention, and expertise as we develop the rules, and have a great rest of your day. We'll hang on for a little bit if you have questions.
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation and presentation.
Thank you, guys.